Welcome, everyone. I am so honored that you've joined us today, and I'm even more honored to introduce you to our esteemed guest today, um, Naomi Shihab Nye. She actually doesn't need an introduction. She is one of my favorite poets of all times, and we're really grateful that she's here with us at the Breaking Bias Summit. For those of you who don't know her, she is a Palestinian-American writer, editor, and educator who grew up in St. Louis, Jerusalem, and San Antonio, Texas, where she continues to live. She's been Young People's Poet Laureate for the US, sponsored by the Poetry Foundation, as well as the poetry editor for the New York Times Magazine, the Texas Observer, and a visiting writer in hundreds of schools and communities all over the globe. She's published and contributed to over 30 volumes of poetry, including my favorite, Words Under the Words. And she's received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Texas Institute of Letters, the Arab American National Museum, and the National Book Critics Circle. So thank you so much, Naomi, for being here with us, and welcome.
Thank you, Anu. It's such a pleasure to see you again and be with you.
Yes. One of the things that, I find often awkward when I'm reading people's bios and others are reading my bios is, how much they don't cover and
Right,
how little they actually describe who we feel we actually are.
right.
So I'd love
Yeah.
to learn, I'd love for you to share a little bit about who Naomi is,
Ah,
outside of the words and the accomplishments and the doings of the world.
yeah. You're so kind to ask that question. You're so correct saying that um, our bios really sometimes don't give a clear. I mean, they give like a little framework, a little scaffolding of
Yeah.
some things that have come our way, but I certainly never feel as if I am worthy of something called lifetime achievement. I don't even feel as if achievement is really a big word in my vocabulary. That's not
Mm,
something I've ever thought in terms of. But recently, someone said, if you could think of, I think it was a student at a university I was visiting, if you could think of a moment in your life that as a writer, that feels like a pinnacle moment, um, the best kind of moment, what would it be? And I said, really, it would be being with students like this, having a
yes.
conversation, a dialogue, because that's what I did my whole life, since I went out of being a student myself into being a student on the other side,
Yes.
uh, of standing in front of the classroom and guiding a classroom. Um, I've been a very devoted encourager of student writing, of other people's material. I've
Mhm.
I've tried to help students see how much material they have. So I think those have been some of the happiest moments when there's that chord of connection
Yeah.
between the visiting person and the students, whoever they are, wherever they are. And one great thing, Anu, is in my traveling life, I feel so thankful that really this dynamic has always
Mm.
worked. Like to invite students to share their voices. It may take a while to get to help them write things, to encourage them to write, to want to read, but it always works. Something
Yeah.
works. It's not like this delusion that I had that
Yeah.
one poet could inspire other writing.
Yeah.
It's taking the inspiration that I felt from all the poets I read when I was growing up,
Mm.
to want to write myself, taking that into a different format in a classroom or in a group session and seeing what happens. And it always happens. I
Yeah.
mean, always. Even in a situation that many people might think of as
Yeah.
being awkward or difficult, a prison, a detention center, a mental health facility, uh, a hospital, all the places I've worked, it always happens. Something always happens
You know,
that's
it's
meaningful.
it's so beautiful that you've shared that because I think when I think of you, I really think of you as a student of life,
Oh,
because your words really capture your observations, your insights, your emotions, your feelings, your
Thank you.
even somatic sensations that you're observing,
Yeah,
through this awareness that we've been given. So I'd love to invite you to kind of start us off, with a poem.
sure.
Um, one of my
Um,
favorites is Kindness, if you'd like to start us there. And
sure. It's always good to start with kindness. I'm very grateful that this poem has had its own life, traveling out and making friends. And, that's something I believed about sending out poems from the very beginning in my childhood when I started sending them out, was that if you allowed a piece of your own work to travel, like your book that's coming out or my book that just came out, you just don't know what friends it's going to make. You have no
yes,
idea the the work it's going to be doing when you're not even looking. And that seemed like such a pleasure of a thought, that
yeah,
words themselves could travel, could do their job. So the poem Kindness, here it is. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth.
Hmm.
What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you. He too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive.
Hmm.
Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere
Hmm.
like a shadow or a friend.
Hmm.
Oh, Anu, thank you for
Hmm.
allowing me to read that. Right now, I've felt so desperate for more kindness in the region of Gaza, Palestine, Israel in the past 7 months, however many months it's been, terrible months.
Hmm.
Uh, I know there are so many kind people there who are suffering and
Yes.
who did nothing, who have done nothing to deserve such a traumatic situation. And all the doctors and all the food aid workers and the UN mediators and, just everybody, all the teachers. I've been in touch with a beautiful teacher I used to volunteer with in Gaza through Zoom, through the COVID period. Uh, she's a literacy expert. And just to follow her trail as she has been separated from her students and worried about her mother and her two sisters and what does she do next, and to know what her devotions were to voice, to language, and to think how war uh, really insults all of us who believe in language,
Yeah.
because it says, no more chance for language. Yeah, it's, you know
Yeah.
I, I have a friend who just skydived or went skydiving in Ireland to celebrate her 90th birthday.
Wow.
Amazing. And she wore a sign on her chest that says, "Peace takes brains." Her
Yes.
name is Lelia Doolan, and she lives near Galway, Ireland. And she was raising money through her charity Jump for Doctors Without Borders.
Yes.
And I'm I'm so impressed that she would do that, for one thing.
Yeah.
She's kind of a wild risk taker anyway. And I just love that she wore that sign, "Peace
Yeah, peace
takes
takes
brains,"
brains.
because I think war doesn't take the right kind of brains. No,
Mm-mm.
it's
It's
not.
reactionary. It's
Yes,
reactionary. You know
yes.
what's so when I was listening to you, and every time I listen to you when you read that poem and many of your other poems, I just start tearing up because something about the way you've arranged the words
Mm.
makes me feel kindness within my body.
Oh,
And the second I feel that, this sensation of kindness, this being that kindness is, right? Almost thinking about this being that kind of takes over our existence, um, tears come out because they touch something that's so vital for us to touch. And I'm curious, for me, like looking at your life, there were two things actually. One is, as you were beginning to share this poem, I had this insight that here you are, you know, Palestinian Arab American poet, and so many of your ancestors were poet. As someone from South Asia, I know that in our tradition, poetry is something we share. My mom will just like come out with a poem to like mark an occasion, or the little couplets here and there.
right.
Um,
Beautiful.
what do you think is the role of poetry, poets, and artists at this time? This
Oh,
time of deep
well,
polarization.
many poets are feeling uh, an urgency about, speaking the words of life.
Yeah.
Like a poet friend in Honolulu, Brandy Nalani McDougall. Today, her poem that's on poets.org is dedicated to Rifat Alarir, and his poem about "If I must die," the Gazan poet, teacher, "If I must die, then you must live to say these words." So I
Yeah.
think poets, and Brandy is such a beautiful poet, and her poem is like it's a chorus of acclamation for his life and for all of the lives that are being lost unnecessarily.
Mm,
And that feeling of, we have to witness, we have to
yeah.
make something come alive. I can't bring Rifat back to life, but I could quote him, I could speak his words. I know the beloved poet Mossab Abu Toha, who's now in Egypt, has felt this way very strongly for everyone in Gaza, not just other poets, but
Yeah.
for all his neighbors and family, everyone there. And that feeling that the job of poetry is to encourage us to notice and to cherish and
Yeah.
to hold. When I think of South Asian poetry or Indian poetry, I think
Yeah.
of how I felt reading it. I felt so close to India through the years.
Yeah.
Um, just reading details and foods and savory spices and just plant names, even before I ever went there. And that feeling that you could create a world and
Mm,
offer up a world is one of the tasks of poetry. And unfortunately, too often, I think these days, poetry is having to be an elegy, for something.
yeah.
This town is gone. These Roman baths are devastated. This place will never be what it was again. So we need to remember it. We need to think about it, look at it. And
Mm,
um, yeah, I've always felt that, in some ways, poetry is the actual opposite of war, because poetry is celebrating and noticing
yeah.
what exists, and war is destroying uh, something that exists.
Yeah.
So that's very encounter.
And the very act of poetry, one of the things I was curious to learn is, why did you say yes to talking to me about breaking bias? What yes to the summit? You know.
Well, you sound so nice when you write a letter, for one thing, and we met before, and also your whole the whole theme of breaking a bias. I think even if you're a person who's never left the United States, has always been in the United States, really has a primary interest is only the United States, still there's plenty of bias to go around right here,
Yes.
right now, that you don't have to be looking at it in a global way. And
Yeah.
so just the idea that talking to you, we could say something about, what we're living, what we're feeling, what we're hoping for. Um, one time, not that long ago, some teachers asked me at a big teachers meeting, what have you done over the years when students in your classes made fun of one another?
Hmm.
And I I was I had to think. I just started thinking and I thought, that really has never happened. Students in all these years have not made fun of one another. One or two times I had an experience where I felt the teacher made fun of the student who had just
Students.
read. And it was, like saying something a little bit insulting, like a private
Mm.
joke, like, "I'm so shocked that you even could, have enough of a brain to write that poem."
Wow.
Um, and I felt very saddened by that and tried to talk to the teachers afterwards about, that kind of immediate judgment of a student's voice. But I really have never felt students be cruel to one another when they recognized an honest voice was being shared. And
Yeah.
yeah, never. And to me, that's been a great lesson on, the both the welcome of the cordiality of children and young people,
Yeah.
and what happens to us down the road. Because as we know these days, so many people in the United States alone have a bias against other people, other communities.
Yeah.
I feel I'm always having to stand up for the state of Texas because
Yes.
no one likes us. If I travel in other states, people will say, very rude things, seeming rude, like, why would you live in such a place? Or why do you,
Wow.
ugly, insulting things about Texas. I don't know if they do that about a lot of other states, but I really feel it as someone who's lived in Texas this long. So I find myself defending the state
Mhm.
frequently, as if just because I live here, I own it in some way. And I say,
Yeah.
know, um, our state government does not necessarily represent all
The
the people of
people.
Texas. It's a
Yes.
very split state. We're all kinds of people there, all kinds of backgrounds.
Yeah.
And that's been interesting to me because many people think that being half Arab, that I
Yeah.
will always be defending Arabs, but I think in some ways I have to say positive things about Texans even more
Yeah.
because people have a huge bias against Texas.
Yeah. No, I agree. I totally agree. And I think a lot of these, for me, the way I define bias in my book is bias is a learned habit that
Yes,
distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions.
yes,
So
yes,
basically, but just as it's learned, it can be unlearned. And
right.
a lot of what you've shared are the tools to unlearn
Yeah,
mindfulness, noticing, becoming
notice,
aware, you
become
know,
aware. Yeah.
individuation, which is curiosity,
Oh, yes.
leaning in, as you talked about. And then
Right,
pro-social behaviors like, you know, kindness, loving kindness as a skill that
right,
we cultivate in perspective taking, right? When you say in
right,
your poem kindness, imagine being that Indian, that you could
right,
be that Indian, right?
right,
That indigenous person that you'd seen in your travels who
right,
was lying dead.
right,
That's like, wow, like what separates my humanity from this other being's humanity?
right.
And that's
Yeah,
that power of imagination that I think you and poetry allow us to have.
right,
And I was curious if, as we're talking about this idea of bias and whether it's bias towards Arabs and Arab Americans or Texans, so many
right.
different intersectional identities. You'd mentioned a friend of yours Roberto Bonazzi,
Yes.
who had written something about dialogue. I'd
Yes.
love for you to read that.
I would love to read a few parts of this. It's got 15 items in his list. But Roberto
Yes.
Bonazzi was a writer. He was actually born in New York City, but spent almost all of his life in Texas, all over Texas, as a teacher, an editor, and a writing person. He was a beloved friend of ours, and so he wrote this reflections on dialogue years ago. And I'll just read you some that I think are so important, because I've kept this on my desk through the past months, and I keep feeling like we need to be hearing these things or thinking about them.
Mm,
So Roberto wrote, attentive listening is the beginning of true dialogue. Dialogue listens before speaking. Monologue speaks without listening. If you are thinking about what you might say next, you are not listening to what another is saying now. Dialogue builds bridges to communication. Monologue erects walls. Dialogue loves freedom. Monologue lusts for control.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm leaving out some of the longer ones.
Yeah.
Dialogue sees reality through open windows, but monologue stares at its image in the mirror.
Mm,
Dialogue seeks the truth. Monologue seeks only greater power. And I think
yeah.
of that often in terms of political movements, how
Yes.
people are, because usually the leaders who want a lot of power are the ones who are less willing to be listening to alternative views.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Uh, Monologue is driven mad by power and the fear of losing it.
Yeah.
Dialogue keeps its sanity in the balance of justice and responsibility. The last one down here, and I've left some out, is dialogue unites, monologue separates. And, I've had so much dialogue over the past 7 months, not only with my Arab friends and my Arab American friends, but with my Jewish friends. And many Jewish friends have expressed to me that they are feeling in uh, grievous ways separated from their own communities. And
Yes.
so they're reaching out to me, and which is kind of funny. And I'm very happy to talk to them. But I have felt how, whatever circumstances we're in, it's so good to reach out to someone at any time who
Yeah.
others might assume you're on the other side from.
Yeah.
How that helps us, even if we never felt on the other side. Like, I was raised by my Palestinian father to
Yeah.
feel that Jewish people were my brothers and sisters. And
Amen.
he had grown up in a Jerusalem which honored that principle.
Yes.
His own friends, his own neighbors, were a mixture of Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims, Orthodox, Armenians, Greeks, everybody.
Yes.
And yeah, there's such a mixture. And that was a joy to him.
Yeah.
He was never in the United States just saying, "Oh, let me go see how many Palestinians I can find here." He
Right.
was saying, "Let me meet everybody. I want to know people." And
Yeah.
that has always been kind of my code in life is,
Yeah.
you're looking for people to get to know, not people who match you. And
Yeah.
I think there's also this craving for, matching with monologue.
I mean, he was such a curious being, right? And he
Right.
was able to relate across difference. As you were sharing those words about dialogue, I thought of, there's a reason why, many people say in the church, God gave us two ears and one mouth,
Oh,
right?
nice. Yeah.
So like dialogue takes those ears and
Yeah.
then communicates, whereas monologues are just driven by the ego.
Yes.
Um,
Something you said earlier too about how to penetrate bias. Sometimes all we need to do is, we don't have to tell ourselves, "Oh, I've been wrong, so wrong all this time." Just pause and
Yeah.
notice and listen. And
Yeah.
if we notice and listen, things change. In the past many years of my life, I have met so many people who went to Palestine, Israel, on all kinds of trips, whether just as tourists or as holy pilgrims or on archaeological digs or all kinds of journeys. And so often they come back and say, well, I thought I didn't feel comfortable, especially like if they're Jewish people who are going to be in Israel. I thought I wasn't going to feel comfortable going to an Arab sector. But then I had this driver who was so hospitable, and he took me everywhere, and we became the best friends of my whole trip. And
Yeah.
often their whole perspective of Palestine and Israel will change because they rode around with one guy.
One person.
One,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
and same in Texas. I've been in the position to host. I can think of three specific people within the last month who are very creative, culturally oriented people in the
Yeah.
world of the arts, open minds, who came to Texas for the first time. And they all had the same commentaries.
Yeah.
Number one, I had no idea it was so beautiful. I had no idea there were such cross cultural currents everywhere you look.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea people here would be so nice. Every one of them has had this litany of discoveries they made in Texas. And
Yeah.
I thought I was very happy to send them on their way with, all their new good thoughts. But that's what happens when people would go to Palestine and Israel too. And often people would come back saying, and wait a minute, there is so much injustice there. And then I
Yeah.
would turn them toward, Jimmy Carter's book about apartheid. And
Yeah.
and I would remember the astonishing bias that he experienced after that book came out. All the places that tried to
Yeah.
cancel his book signings. And, I'm so grateful to the filmmaker Jonathan Demme for making that film, Jimmy
Yeah.
Carter, The Man from Plains, which documented very, very specifically and graphically
Yeah.
everything President Carter went through,
Yeah.
simply by standing up for justice.
It's so true. And you spoke about this, what bias does is that it creates this us versus them.
Yeah, yeah.
And for me, like, when I think of Rumi, he has this thing that beyond rights and wrongs,
Oh my
there's
God.
a field and I'll
Oh,
meet you there.
that's my favorite
Because
line. Yeah.
there is no them. It's
No.
just us.
Yeah.
We're just all human, right? So
Yeah.
beyond these divides of, Israelis and Palestinians and
Yeah.
all the other divisions within, it's just us,
Yeah. And of course, there have been so many people who have beautiful initiatives, Anu, that try to live out that reality.
Yes.
From the Nevi Shalom, Wahat al Salam village in
Yes.
Israel to the Seeds of Peace group for teenagers
Yeah.
that's been going on for years, to the East West Orchestra that was founded by Daniel Barenboim and Dr.
Yeah.
Edward Said, and all the hand in hand schools in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
I believe founded by a Jewish American.
Hmm.
Just these amazing cross cultural connecting initiatives. And
Yeah.
I feel as if all of those great works, those endeavors, get betrayed uh, by war, by this war that's
My
been
war.
going.
Yeah.
And when the United States is so unimaginative to just say, okay, well, we wish for peace, but we're going to keep sending bombs.
Yeah.
That's not working. It doesn't work. I mean, if
Yeah.
you're 8 years old, my grandson can see that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's very frustrating. And you think if we put the same amounts of money into positive endeavors to
Yeah.
force people to work together economically, culturally, every way possible,
Yeah.
agriculturally, um, just think what we could have done. Oh,
And we can continue to do it, right?
do it. And
We
just think
can do it.
all the things and all the lives that have been lost while we weren't
Yeah.
doing it. I think
Yeah.
for poets and creative people, this is just so frustrating to think
Yeah.
that, we have wasted so many resources and so
Yeah.
much time and so many lives. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, when I was writing the book, and of course I had to dig, and I talk a lot about race and gender and ethnicity and colonialism. And, you know, of course, I was with a lot of primary text that was very heavy because the loss of lives we're witnessing now is the
Yeah.
same that was 2 decades ago, 4 decades ago, 6 decades ago, 8 decades ago in so many different parts of the world. And what gave me comfort and continues to give me comfort is, you know, Eckhart Tolle in his book, A New Earth, talks about this as well, that when we look at the evolution of human consciousness over time, it is moving towards more collaboration. It is moving towards more understanding. It is moving towards more compassion. Think about, you know, the Middle Ages, for example, where people were being burnt, like women in particular, were being burnt on stake for playing with plants and animals, right? You know, like literally, that was where the human consciousness was. But in this period, we've shifted so much in, you know, slavery and genocide of indigenous people, and yet we still have war. And
Yeah.
for me, that's what breaking bias really offers,
We
is
need
that,
it so much.
and the work has to really begin internally. So for me, like, what I want to ask is something that so inspires me and amazes me about you, Naomi, is what is your secret sauce? Like, how have you been able to, you know, keep such a deep grounding despite witnessing such horrors in our world?
Well, you are very kind to assume that I have any sauce at all. Um, I do think that being a person who loves voice, who loves,
Mm,
beautiful poems, beautiful songs, all the expressions of voice. Yesterday, the death of Alice Munro, I loved her short
mm,
stories from Canada. I remember sharing them with students over the years and the conversations we would have, how Alice Munro would lead us into just looking at generations as a fabric.
yeah.
How do we all evolve together? Um, it's a mystery. I think as a child, I realized that uh, there was certainly a lot of sadness in the world, um, and something I've written about in my new book, which is called Grace
Yes.
Notes.
I was going
Grace
to ask you about
Notes is
this.
about families. This beautiful cover is by a painter in New Mexico named Lynn Avril. I'm grateful to
Beautiful.
her. I don't know her. But in writing about my mother in Grace Notes and just families in general, my mother really came from a line of depressive Germans and Swiss people, and who were immigrants to the US. And my mother was pretty serious depressive when I was a child. Her mother had been, her grandmother had been. I mean, I don't know how far back it went, but
Portland.
it was a line of a deep sorrow and sadness. And growing up with a depressed mother, and that was not something. But my mother was also brilliant. She was so smart and so curious and so open to the world. And
Right.
she met the first Palestinian she ever married. I mean, she married the first Palestinian she ever met.
Yeah, at
So
a
I
time
think
of like
bravery.
anti
Is that time?
anti miscegenation, and this person
Right.
was
Yeah.
outside of her faith and
Right.
color and
Yeah.
region. And
And she had already stood up to her parents about their faith, because their faith was of a quite narrow variety of Lutheranism, which
mm,
some of those German immigrants who came to the US were very insistent on. We're the only right people in the world, despite the fact that there are all these other people. Somehow we managed to be the only right ones.
yeah.
And I really remember this milieu of my interesting parents who didn't match each other in any way other than both being very open minded. And my father was a cheerful person, but he was a refugee. And so
Mm,
he had a lot of sorrow, a lot of homesickness, of a very specific kind, always worrying about his family. Could we go back and live in Jerusalem, which he really wanted to do? Um, and then my mother was struggling with her this level of depression, which would engulf her
yeah.
regularly. And I never heard the word depression as a child. I think
Wow.
it was not something people talked about openly like they do now. So as a child, I realized, I have to kind of be the comic relief in this family. Um, and I have to help my mother see the bright side of every day.
Wow.
I have to carry some hope here. So I did see that very uh, specifically as my job as a child. I have to make her laugh. I have to um, uh, just, carry the good story, whatever good story I heard today about anything. I have to take
Mm.
it home and share it with her. And uh, I think, it created a certain resilience, but also it's partly why I took a lot of comfort in voices in books
Mm.
because they seemed calm to me. They weren't traumatized, or maybe they had lived through trauma, but they were now at a place where they could speak about it. And so to be with a book felt very comforting. And, just to be reading every single day was was huge to me as a child. So
Wow.
I think having an awareness of all the lives that were out there and all the voices that were out there um, was crucial to developing just some sense of connection with the larger world beyond my own,
It's
interesting bicultural household.
it's so beautiful because what you're describing is like this intergenerational inheritance,
Yeah,
right? That could have been yours. That sadness from your mother's side could have been yours, and you interrupted that cycle through humor, through poetry, through
yeah,
noticing what
yeah.
else is possible.
Uh,
And for me, like that's what's a lot of us are struggling with. I think that really resonates with me too, because I witnessed that line in some of my family members, and
yeah,
I think it was just these bigger causes. For my family, it was partition of
right,
India, right? So these huge political things, right? And there are like millions of people impacted, and
right,
yet we don't talk about it. We don't talk about why we're sad.
right,
We've left our homeland, for your mom's side, Switzerland. This is what's familiar for thousands
right.
of years to us. And now we're here in this new land and
Yeah,
miss it, but we can't verbalize it because we have land, because
right.
we have wealth or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Um,
A kind of a homesickness that went, or a restlessness that went
yes,
unspoken many times.
yes,
And, of course, I think we all regret the questions we didn't ask our grandparents who we could have. And, I have so many questions I would ask my Palestinian grandmother. I never knew my grandfather on that side. And my German grandparents, so many questions I would ask them now about their own survival and their own
yeah,
attitudes and what formed those attitudes, and did they ever rebel against them as my mother was brave enough to do. I looked
mm,
at her as a rebel, and so I really admired that in her. but
yeah,
but I also saw how being overwhelmed with depression made it very hard to function, and
yeah,
that was something important to me as a child. I wanted to be able to function, and that if
yeah,
you stayed sad too much, it was hard, to do things or to have
yeah,
enthusiasm to do things. I look often, and I've talked about this with kids in China who asked me once. I was working in some schools in China, and the kids asked me, could you be as brave as your father was? And some of them were Chinese kids, some were Korean kids. I mean, they were all mixtures of kids in international schools. Could you be as brave as your father was and come here, for example, come live in China, learn Chinese, speak Chinese, be with us forever? And I said, what? I don't think I could.
yeah,
Um,
I
I don't think I am that brave. I love being here. I love knowing you. I think this is a magical, amazing country, but I don't think I could leave the whole world I've ever known and
mm,
move to another world and take on another life in that
yeah,
way. And so then you think about, all the people who are coming here in extreme struggle these days. I live 2 hours from the Mexico border in
yes,
Texas, and the the people who are arriving, not as my father did with a university scholarship, where
yeah,
somebody was going to welcome him somewhere, but who are arriving here thinking people don't want us. They're going to try to kick us out, and
Yeah.
we have nothing. I mean, how do they begin? Where do they start? How
Yeah.
are they not depressed? I mean, I'm marveling every day that more people aren't depressed in
Yeah.
ways because of what they're suffering, all this cross-border
Yeah.
transit.
Well, it's so beautiful because I've worked with some of those folks, and I don't know all of them, but just in my experiences, there is this hope that glimmers through.
Yeah,
And what the reason why they take, at least the ones I've known, they move past all these incredible odds
yeah,
is because of
right,
love of their family members, love
right.
of those people that they've left behind, love of their own lives,
Yeah,
and this hope that they carry that they deserve better, they can do better.
right.
And it's interesting, right? Because both of those things can coexist.
Yeah,
Love can coexist with depression, and
yes.
that's
Oh,
like the
yes.
paradox of our lives. Um,
Right. No, that's so beautiful. The only love. I have a friend here in Texas. Her motto in life is only love. And whenever there's a terrible, a dilemma, a problem, she just will say that. She has a bumper sticker on her car, only love. Uh,
yeah,
yeah, and you make me think of a few years ago, I was asked to go to visit an ESL program, English as a second language for
language.
adults. And adults, it was happening at a church here, and I got there. They wanted me to just read poems to them and talk. And I said, well, I'm happy to visit them and talk, but could I invite them to write? And one of the teachers said, well, we don't do that. And I said, well, why not? Are they literate in any language? And she said, yes, but we don't really ask them to write. And I said, well, get some paper and some pencils because I'm
Sometimes.
going to ask them. I'm coming and that's what I do. So that day, about 50 people, I was surprised how many were there, wrote the most. And I told them, you can write in your original language, your first language. You can have someone else translate it. You can write in English if you want. I don't care about your grammar or spelling. You can do
Yeah.
anything you want. But just gave them a few prompts and invitations, what they
Mm,
might write about. And so much love, Anu, came out in these pieces. Their
yes.
love for what they had left behind, their love for what they were trying to create in this new world,
Yes.
their love for one another, their love for memory. I mean, it was
Yes.
an overwhelming day. And when I left there crying, all the teachers were crying. I said, just promise me you will let them write.
Yeah.
Because they needed to hear each other much more than they needed to hear me. And it
Yeah.
was such a gift to, even if they only wrote 2 sentences, to participate in their own thinking in that
Hmm.
way.
Well, basically, love is the antidote to loneliness,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
that was me. You know what? I know you mentioned your new book, Grace Notes. I'd love for you to read a few poems or a poem from
Sure.
the book if
I'll
you'd
read
like.
from Grace Notes. Thank you. Um, um, Elsewhere, and there's a proverb at the top from Mali. No matter how far the town, there is another beyond it. Always we were imagining others, the ones who slept when we woke and woke when we slept. We were calling out to the far towns, hoping they found enough food. Their bowls were filled with fruit, hoping the night air held them gently too.
Hmm.
Did we ever think of you enough, far town? Were we able to imagine your rivers, your pain? Did you sometimes feel the world forgot you? You were the world as much as we were. You
Wow.
always think that when you go out, at least in Texas, we go out driving sometimes on weekends, and we go to a little town, and we'll spend the whole day there and talk to people, go to a local restaurant, and we come home and we're changed. We just
Yeah.
think we never thought about those people in that town before. And now we're picturing them, we're hearing their voices, what they told us, their stories, their details. Um, so here. May I read one other from
Yes,
Grace?
please.
Okay. So this is called Legacy. My whole life would not have happened without a man whose name I do not know, who died in the snow. He was young, had been married only 3 months to my mama's best friend. Walking on a wintry path in Kansas, he toppled into a snowbank, dead. That's it, all the information. When he died so suddenly, my mama moved to the town where his young bride lived to console her for a few months as she got over the shock. Her friend had a job, so my future mama got a temporary job selling sewing machines and a volunteer job in a hospital where she met my dad, who had just landed from the other side of the world. See? The snowbank, the poor frozen man. I owe him everything.
Oh, how beautiful. And it speaks
Well,
to the interdependence.
yeah, I mean, just think. And I know the name of the best friend, the woman, but in no records have I been able to find out his name.
His name.
His
Wow.
name. And, in every one of our lives, there are probably 100 little hinges like that. What are
Yes.
the hinges, that connected us to even existing, to even being born? How our parents met, if somebody had gone right instead of left, it's just so quirky. I, I met my husband so many years ago in a restaurant downtown, and we lived downtown too, a few blocks from here, in a restaurant.
Wow.
Yeah, and just randomly, um, at a table for four, and there were only two of us, myself and a woman friend, and two men came in and they couldn't find a table, and I said, "Well, you could sit here." I,
Oh wow, that's a
yeah,
Hollywood blockbuster
yeah, yeah.
yet to be made.
For how long will you sit here? Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
So there's a
Um,
sense, Anu, I think of we have to live um, in open ways. I mean, that's
mm,
something I learned from my parents, and they were open enough to embrace one another and accept one another's worlds. My father lived in this country, my mother lived in his country. To be able to experience this kind of drastic melding together of histories and lifetimes. And I just hope that we can keep raising children and grandchildren in this world, generations that are curious about one another. All those words you said at the beginning, people who will wish to know one another and
yes,
not be seeing others as enemies.
yes. Thank you so much, Naomi. This has been so like life-giving to hear your words and your perspective, and you know, would love to. One reflection that I have: not see one another as enemies, and really starting with themselves, not seeing themselves as their enemies. You know,
Yeah,
so
right. Because we all have parts of ourselves that we have to become gracious toward and figure out how do I carry that? What do I do with that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do you have any last words for our listeners, for our
Well,
viewers?
I would just say, please know that the children of Palestine and Gaza are as beautiful and as hopeful, joyous, full of dreams and wishes, maybe some fewer dreams now, but as any children you've ever known. And I know the children in Israel are that way. I've met them, I've been there. I know the children in any place we've never been are that way. And if we can have, big enough hearts to not to start viewing one another as negative forces. I've been very, very saddened by how lately I have felt the news even using the word Palestinian, to be pro-Palestinian, as
Yes.
a negative.
Yeah.
That's not a negative, that's beautiful to us. We have felt invisible for so long in the world scheme of things. But we weren't. We were there. We were just humans like everybody else. And I think of all the beautiful Palestinians who struggle so hard just to continue. So just please, all of us, keep thinking about anyone you might see as an other. Yeah.
Mm.
And I do sometimes feel myself really reminding myself of that in Texas when I, observe or witness somebody I might imagine, well, not hanging out with that guy. But
Yeah.
then I think, wait a minute, he could be the nicest person. Why am I making that judgment? You know?
Ashe.
Yeah.
Ashe. May it be so. May we overcome this drive for otherness within and without. Mm.
Thank you, Anu. Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much for
Naomi.
your great heart, your great spirit. And I hope we meet again in real life too.
Inshallah. Yes.
Well,
Yes.
inshallah, I'll be looking for you. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you for your time.
Thank
Bye.
you.